Hello everyone, this is Ryan with HUSNG.com, and today we're going to talk about playing flops out of position, specifically leading the flop in a raised pot. We're going to go ahead and begin with a few questions that a member submitted to me, and then we'll go through some examples, specific examples of situations where it may be appropriate to lead, or when it is going to be appropriate to lead. Okay, starting with these questions, member submitted questions. First question, what are we trying to accomplish with a flop lead? Well, as with most decisions, we're trying to maximize our overall edge in every situation. Specifically, this might mean that we're looking to give ourselves the most fold equity with a certain hand, or the most value with a strong hand. You might have heard the common advice of building large pots out of position with weaker hands is not ideal. This is generally good advice. However, this does not mean that you should never lead for value with a middle or weaker strength type hand on the flop, nor does it mean that you should never lead the flop with an extremely weak hand, particularly when you feel that a lead will often result in a fold. So while it can be good to follow the common rules of advice, just make sure that these rules do not keep you from thinking outside of the box and finding new ways to beat your opponent. The second question is, how does board texture impact our decision? In short, it impacts your decision greatly at times. The best way to approach board texture is to first look at the information that you have about your opponent's pre-flop raising range. If they're open folding a lot, it's likely that they are not raising a lot of weaker starting hands, which happen to often contain cards such as 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, depending on the extent of their folding range. Once you have that information that your opponent is open folding a lot of weaker hands pre-flop, you can basically make the connection that it isn't too likely that your opponent has a hand or a pair on lower card boards. Now this all is going to vary tremendously. Flush and straight draws being present on the flop can increase the amount of potential hands your opponent will proceed with, but ultimately you'll want to try to make the connection between their pre-flop raising range and the types of flops that they are more or less likely to have a made hand on, or rather to make a hand on. From there, it will be much easier to accurately make a decision because you'll have some idea of the amount of fold equity you may have on a certain flop, or the types of hands your opponent may be calling with. The next question is, how does your opponent's reaction or characteristics impact our decision? This is really the most important thing to look at when deciding whether or not to lead a flop. You want to have some idea if your opponent is very loose, very aggressive, passive, weak, or any other extreme. Some things to specifically look at would be, first and foremost, how often your opponent continuation bets, and with what types of hands are they continuation betting with. If your opponent is not continuation betting a lot, that's one obvious situation where you may find that leading the flop for value is going to be the best decision possible, and quite often the only way that you can actually get value from a strong hand. You'll also want to consider other characteristics from your opponent. How aggressive are they? Are they bluffing a lot? These two pieces of information can allow you to get an idea of how your opponent will respond to your lead. Another piece of information that is valuable is how loose your opponent is going to be when you actually do lead. So trying to assemble this sort of information can really help you make a good decision on whether or not to lead the flop. Besides those characteristics, you'll also want to pay attention to your opponent's reactions when you lead. This is extremely important, since opponents may react weak to a check raise, but then react much more loose and aggressively to a flop lead. So once you have actually led the flop, pay attention to their reaction and all the other information in the situation. Things like the type of board, the size of the pot, the blind level or stack sizes. All of this stuff is very relevant and can help you make a better decision in future situations where a lead may be very good or very bad, depending on the information that you actually have. And the last question on this page, when should you lead the flop with a medium strength hand? This is a very common question that players ask. It can be very obvious to lead the flop with a strong hand. It can be very obvious not to lead the flop with a very weak hand if you don't have the fold equity. But what do you do with a medium strength hand? The most obvious situation that comes to mind would be against a very loose but passive opponent. What I mean by loose and passive would be an opponent that will call your bets with a wide range of hands, but not often bet themselves. This means that your opponent is not likely to continuation bet if you check the flop with your middle strength hand. Say a hand like 9-7 on a Queen 9-5 board. Now the other key to that example is that your opponent will call your bets with a wide range of hands. This means that they're loose. So you both notice that they will give you value when you do bet, and that if you do not bet, you will not gain value. So that's one obvious situation where leading a medium strength hand is going to be ideal. Some less common situations where leading the flop with a medium strength hand is appropriate would be against an opponent that is unbalanced in favorable ways to a lead. Specifically, this would be anything from an opponent that raises your leads with bluffs a very large percentage of the time, thus giving you great value for your hand, or an opponent that calls all his weaker hands, bluffs with a large size, and makes a very small raise size with stronger hands. In that latter situation I just talked about, your opponent is giving you such clear information that you can use to react perfectly to, so a lead really makes sense, just because you really know what to do next, because they're very unbalanced and predictable. So those are some situations where leading with a medium strength hand can absolutely be appropriate. Now let's move on to some examples, specific examples of hands. We're going to go ahead and use a fairly basic flop, a rainbow flop, King of Hearts, Nine of Spades, Five of Diamonds here. And these four situations and comments were submitted by a member. Okay, so when holding King 10 offsuit on this King 9-5 rainbow board, the member says, I don't really lead here against any kind of opponent. If the game flow has been extremely aggressive, I might check raise, but I check call something like 80% of the time here. I think this might be a leak. Well, my response to that would be that you'll want to lead in these situations when your opponent doesn't often continuation bet, particularly when your opponent does not continuation bet with weaker draws or pairs, such as Jack 10, Queen 10, a pair of nines, pair of fives. This would be a textbook example of a good situation to lead for value against a passive opponent. Depending on how loose they are, you may pick up additional value from weaker draws, such as 8-7 or 7-6. The biggest mistake I often see opponents make is that they will still lead the flop for value with King 10, even if I have been continuation betting near 100% of the time. So use that common error as an example to just make sure that you're considering a check raise or check call option specifically against opponents that continuation bet a lot, as it's just going to give you a lot of instant value when you check and they c-bet with their entire range. So that example just really tells you that while a lead can certainly be profitable, you want to make sure that a check raise or a check call may not be more profitable. So you really want to pay attention to those variables. Okay, moving on to our second example. This is an example of second pair, top kicker, ace-9. 80% of the time I check call here, sometimes I lead. But reasoning for leading is usually what I saw, a lead in a video. I can't really grasp why to lead or check raise. And that's what a member submitted here. Well, with this hand you should look to lead against looser opponents. Against tighter opponents you're just not getting enough value when you lead here, as they're more likely to fold weaker nines and all bottom pairs, as well as some of the weaker draws like 8-7 and perhaps even Jack 10, depending on how tight they actually are. But against loose opponents this is clear value, so you can often lead and pick up value from so many weaker hands in this situation. Again, you'll want to pay attention to their continuation bet percentage. If they're continuation betting an extremely high percentage, you might want to opt for a check call or a check raise, depending on how they would react to a check raise on the flop and how often they bet various turn cards. As you can see, there's not going to be a specific answer all the time, such as you should always lead here against a loose player. But this is really good. The game is not so simple or easy to master, which really means that becoming more familiar in these situations offers a lot more advantages and ultimately profit to you. Okay, so when you're holding Queen Jack offsuit on this King 9-5 board, the member here says, here I like to check call, check raise, or lead, but never check fold. Again, I think that my action is too much feeling dependent, which really means that you don't have a lot of reasons for the actions that you're taking. That's a very good observation to make, a very honest observation to make about yourself. It can ultimately help you improve. So with Queen Jack offsuit, I usually like to lead this type of hand when facing opponents that react to bets in a more passive or weak way, which means that they either call a lot or fold a lot. Basically not raising a lot. One example would be an opponent that is passive when facing bets, meaning there's very little fear that I will be raised out of the pot when I lead. The more fold equity that I have in this situation, the better I really feel about a lead. This is particularly true when an opponent is continuation betting often, but not 100%. If they are frequently raising preflop and continuation betting 100%, you both have good pair outs, 4 gut shot outs, and plenty of high card value from queen high. So you'd be fine in that situation to just check call. However, if an opponent is c-betting around 2/3 to 3/4 of the hands of the boards, and their opening range is somewhat wide, but not every hand, it's less clear to me that check calling with queen jack is going to be a good play. So in that situation, if I see that my opponent is passive when I lead and is not a pure calling station to a single, double, or even triple barrel, I'll go ahead and make a lead, and my hand is essentially a semi-bluff. I likely have some outs to make the best hand against their calling range, but I'm perfectly happy to see them fold. So with queen jack offsuit on this board, you'll want to consider their opening range, their continuation betting range, and even their reactions to check raises, and try to weigh that against the viability of a flop lead. If you don't see much information that makes you feel a lead can be a good play, it's likely that leading is just going to build a larger pot out of position with a fairly weak hand, and without any advantages that you see, that's not putting you in a good spot moving into the turn and the river. Okay, moving on to our last example, which is 8-7, a gut shot draw on this king 9-5 board. Member says, most of the time I obviously check fold here, but I assume that this is a decent situation to bluff. I never lead here. Well, 8-7 offsuit, this is really similar to the queen jack hand. However, there are two important differences. With queen jack, we had some high card value against opponents that called with very weak hands, such as 7-6, jack 10, 8-7, or other non-pairs weaker than an ace. The other important difference is that the 6 pair outs with queen jack, they will make stronger pairs that can gain value from hands such as a pair of 9s, whereas the 6 pair outs from 8-7 can only gain value from 5x type pairs or weaker pocket pairs. So those are the two main differences between the 8-7 and the queen jack hand. In the end, this ends up meaning that you need to be more certain that your opponent will offer you the fold equity when you do decide to lead the flop, or if they don't offer a lot of fold equity to a flop lead, that they offer fold equity to a double or triple barrel. Ultimately, it's the same thing. If your opponent calls every single flop bet when you have 8-7 here, but folds every single time on the turn, you should absolutely bet the flop and then bet the turn as well. You want to think about the entire hand, not just the flop reaction. Otherwise, the same basic points from the queen jack hand are really going to apply to the 8-7 hand. Just make sure that your reads are a little more precise and you're a little more certain, because you really have less equity with 8-7 than queen jack to help make up for any uncertainty or incorrect decision that you may have made. Okay, so to conclude, with the questions and answers, as well as the examples I ran through, you should now have a better idea of when you can use a flop lead to your advantage. You should also find that as you become better at identifying ways to profit in these flop lead situations, that you'll find it ideal to call with more hands pre-flop out of position. While the common advice is to play tighter out of position, that will not apply to any situation where you can see clear profit in calling. And profit in calling out of position often relies on what you can or cannot do post-flop. The more ways you can find to profit against your opponent, the more hands you can start calling with out of position instead of folding. Ultimately, you should become a more profitable player as you do that, and that's really the most important thing at the end of the day. So, I hope you enjoyed the lesson. As always, post any questions in the comment section of the video, and I will happily respond. Have a good session, guys.